If anyone has a question that they would like to ask the ambassador, please feel free to raise your hand. And anybody?
The question is, what are the prospects for CEDAW? And, you know, this is the most often asked question I get any place in the world. Because we in this country have made so many advances in terms of women's rights, our policies, our laws. We still obviously have work to do, but we are more than in compliance with everything that convention stands for. And the world cannot understand why we aren't part of a global commitment to eliminating discrimination and choose instead to stand with the pariah states. So that said, I always tell everybody that our commitment is to ratify, but that it's particularly difficult in the way we have set out our processes in government. We need a supermajority to be able to do that. There's been a whole mythology that has been built up around what will happen to America if CEDAW is ratified, if the Women's Treaty is ratified. And that means the American family will no longer exist as it does. Our federalist system will be threatened. Homeschooling will not be possible, and a host of other things, all of which are not true. So I hope the day will come that we can stand with all the other nations of the world. We are the only industrial democracy in the world that has not ratified the convention.
Thank you. Any other questions? Speak now or...
Thank you. I was just saying to Melanne, and I think she touched on this in her speech, that women's issues are often considered something extra, something superfluous, something that you can only consider when other things are taken care of. When people are involved in nation building, they're often seen as not a primary concern, a secondary, or even a tertiary. I wonder how you address this in your position and what sort of arguments you use and conversations you have with people to try and convince them otherwise.
Well, as I try to say, I think it's changing, and there is increased data to support these kinds of conclusions. And at our peril, do we continue to ignore them? But just like all progress seems to take longer than it should, we're not all on the same page yet. But that's part of our commitment in terms of taking issues. We call them women's issues. I think that's the problem. If we wouldn't call them women's issues and somehow could do what we need to do but call them something else, they'll be taken more seriously. But they are not the kinds of considerations that can be relegated to the sidelines, because we can't get to sustainable peace if women don't participate in the process. There's some 50 conflicts that have taken place in the last couple decades. Of those, 30-some are recurring. And in those 30-some recurring, the peace that did not hold in those situations, women were not part of the process. And whether it's women, peace, and security, or it's economic growth, or it's the key ways to actually create development that works, we know increasingly that this is part of the solution. And you cannot, just like you can't applaud with one hand very well, you can't do much anything without bringing women into the picture. And I think the truest manifestations of that today are going to be in the area of economics, because there is a growing realization that we cannot write off the potential that half of our societies represent and grow economically. And we also know that when these kinds of investments are made to enable women to participate more fully economically, we are going to get more robust outcomes. So I think it will come from the evidence as we go forward, if not from friendly persuasion.
Thank you.
I'm Hasina Shehjan from Afghanistan. Thank you very much for all your concerns and all your help with the Afghan women in Afghanistan for the past 10 years. And it seems that in Afghanistan we're having a different kind of a problem, because by empowering the women, we're in fact disempowering the men, which in turn create a different problem for the women. So how can we create a program that would empower the women and the men, and in fact focusing more on the men in order to make the women's lives better? Because the problem are the men, and for the past 10 years, I'm sorry, but with all respect with the men, for the men, it seems like in Afghanistan the problem have been the men, and we haven't had any women to become a suicide bomber yet. So how can we help the women by empowering the men? Because it seems like we've missed that opportunity in 2002 to design education programs for all the young boys who also were deprived of education during the years of wars. And now those young men are much older. It's almost impossible to keep them in school. So they become the recruits for the extremists. Somehow I feel like we really need to focus on educating the men and giving them employment and jobs, which will make the life of the women a lot better in Afghanistan.
Well, I don't think it's an either-or proposition. I think balance is important in everything. And obviously, girls who have been kept out of school for a generation, and the country has paid a price for that, that needs to be rectified. And with more of them going to school today, that's progress. But it's not progress at the price of leaving boys behind. There's a real effort to put boys and girls in school, just as there is an economic development. Some of the best programs are in agriculture, since a very agrarian society, in animal husbandry, where men and women are benefiting from these programs and bringing collective income into their families. And it's seeing your life getting better that really makes all the difference in the end. There's a program called the National Solidarity Program, which is the very lowest level development program, if you will, in Afghanistan. I think MIT just did a review of it. And it is among the most successful kinds of experiences that is occurring, because at that very local level, whether the resources are going to men and women together, and it depends on the community how they choose to go forward, or it goes to the women as a separate unit and the men separately, but they both benefit, it is succeeding. And I think nothing so much works as success. That when income can come into a family, which is a very basic phenomena, life gets better. There's a direct correlation between economic empowerment for men and women and a decrease in violence against women. So it's a matter of doing both, and that's what we're struggling to do.
Thank you so much, Melanne. Let me go to Lieutenant Governor Healy.
No, I'm sorry. She actually stood up before I did. But very quickly, my name is Pat Bench, and I actually work with a lot of women on our team. And the one question they often ask is, who do you read? Who do you follow? and it's probably one of the simplest questions you had tonight, but is very important, is that information from around the world is traveling very quickly over Twitter and over different media areas, and it's who do you read in the morning, and what columnists and papers do you follow? Thanks.
Well, I only wish I had more time to read more than I do, but I am somebody who can't really change her ways, I guess, is the best way to describe my need to hold those newspapers when I am in the United States. And so I hold the New York Times and the Washington Post, and I'm quite thorough in getting through both of those. And when I travel, I'm obviously on the internet doing the same thing. But I think some of my best information comes from people in the field, people who can give me a firsthand view of what's going on. A lot of the NGOs and others who, business representatives who come through my door constantly and tell me what they see and how they see it. And I think a diversity of information sources is absolutely critical. And one of the problems I think we also have in our country today is that we either watch Fox or we watch MSNBC, and there's nothing in between. You know, unlike all of you, not that much focus on the rest of the world, perhaps. So it's a very important question. I think for a lot of us, we wish we had more time to really be able to absorb everything that's being written, but that's where I come down. Now the Lieutenant Governor.
First of all, Ambassador, congratulations on your award tonight, and thank you so much for your work around the world. I grew up in the South in the 1960s and early 1970s, and so I've recently had the opportunity to work with a number of Afghan women, mostly lawyers and judges, who are doing very dangerous work, people who are putting their lives on the line with the assurance from the American government that what they're doing is what we want them to do, that they have rights, that they have a constitution that guarantees these rights, that they have a legal right to exercise their ability to be lawyers and judges and head prosecutors and so forth and so on in Afghanistan. And these women go out every day and they're incredibly brave, as you were mentioning, these women who are taking huge risks to exercise these rights. And in my mind, what I remember from my time growing up is the bravery of people like Ruby Bridges or Rosa Parks to quietly assert these rights that existed in law but did not exist in practice within their communities. And so when I look at Afghan women, I think of the civil rights struggle here in the United States 50 years ago. And I'm wondering how we can connect those two struggles in the minds of the American people, because I think people can understand that the struggle for civil rights here took a long time. But it really involved the leadership of women who were quietly asserting rights that they possessed, and yet the public wasn't really willing to give them to them fully yet. And I'm just wondering how we might be able to make that connection for the American people, because now here, all we hear about is the terrible sacrifice of our very brave soldiers. And it's tragic when anyone loses their life. And yet, those lives are being given very much in the same vein as the people who went down and were freedom riders in the South 50 years ago. And so I wonder how we can make that connection for people and make them feel that they really are fighting for freedom and equal rights for everyone in Afghanistan, but also especially for women.
Well, you know, whether it's the women in Afghanistan or it's been all those who struggled for democracy over a long, long time, the struggle against totalitarianism, the struggle against slavery, those were moral imperatives. As I believe the moral imperative today is to achieve equality, gender equality, which is still elusive. I don't know what it takes to get people to see this in the way that you described it, which I think is a very thoughtful parallel in many ways. But I am troubled, and that verse or that statement that the woman in Afghanistan said, I think colors some of what we see back here. Because we do look at Afghan women, I believe, through that prism of the victim, the unschooled, the long-suffering, the oppressed, the persecuted, the unimaginable life that is lived. When there are so many who are moving in their own way to be true leaders in the fullness of that word. And I think if we could help them as we are trying, and I know you're trying in the extraordinary work we've been talking about tonight that you are doing there in training lawyers and judges, to help them to understand that it doesn't come overnight. You know, I remember in the 90s when the Soviet Union had collapsed and so many of the countries in the former Soviet Union the people were struggling and the transition was extremely difficult, and they had these great ideas that economic good times and free times were going to come overnight. Well, they didn't come. It was really, really hard for a long time. And part of the message was don't give up, that democracy is hard to do. We're still trying to form that more perfect union, but that it's something you have to work at every day. And I think whether it's the connection between Americans and the struggles in Afghanistan, or whether it's Afghans seeing their own struggle through whatever prism they are looking through, all of this, in a way, is helpful. You know, I often think, as I look at so many women around the world who are still on the outskirts of opportunity and on the real margins of their society, I think of what we went through in this country. You know, it was, over 150 years ago when a brave group of women and the good men who accompanied them, all these causes have the good men to help us make the progress we've made. We're heading to Seneca Falls, New York. And that journey made many of them think, as they wrote in their memoirs, would anybody else be on the road with them? And they were terrified because they were going, if only to improve their lives. You know, if they earned a meager salary, they couldn't keep it. If they had a miserable marriage, they couldn't get out of it. They couldn't vote. They couldn't own property. That was the state in our own country for women, 100 and some years ago. And we've been on a journey, and I see all of us still on a journey, but in different places on that road to equality. And that's what I try to say to the Afghan women, that, you know, we are with you, we understand how tough this is, but you know, persevere, and their perseverance is extraordinary, and don't give up, and it will be worth it in the end. So I don't have any magic bullets, but I think this is a very thoughtful question, and we obviously need to see things in a way that we don't always, and they need to see things in a way they can't always comprehend.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you for reminding us that it's until women become fully equitable, it's like looking through the lenses of a camera and looking at it out of focus. So when women fully come into partnership and equity with their male counterparts, then we will have the picture no longer blurred. There's a wonderful African proverb that says, if you teach a man, you educate an individual, but when you teach a woman, you educate a nation. So thank you for reminding us of that. And I want to thank I want to thank each of you for being here, for participating, for being such a great audience. Thanking both John and Melanne for your wonderful honor, and WorldBoston for choosing these two extraordinary, distinguished people.